That'll Be the Day was Buddy Holly's first big hit. It opened the door to the big time and is one of the records that helped define the sound of rock and roll. But did you know that Buddy had to violate his contract with Decca Records and resort to subterfuge to get that record out so the world could hear it? I'm J.P. McDermott for West Coast Ramble, and this is the true tale of Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day. If you like what you hear, be sure to like and subscribe. Buddy Holly booked his second recording session for Decca Records on July 22, 1956, at Owen Bradley's famous Quonset Hut studio on what would eventually become Music Row in Nashville. Buddy's first session back in January had produced a single, Blue Days, Black Nights, with Love Me on the flip side. The record got decent reviews but didn't sell well. Buddy and his best friend and drummer, J.I. Allison, were anxious to get to Nashville and record a song they'd written about a month earlier called That'll Be the Day. The friends had been to see a John Wayne movie called The Searchers. Wayne's catchphrase in the movie, uttered whenever he disagreed with another character, was,
"That'll be the day."
The guys immediately picked up on the phrase the way the guys do. A day or two later, when Buddy was at J.I.'s house rehearsing, he suggested that the two of them try and write a song. J.I. responded, "That'll be the day." Buddy shot back, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." The song fell into place in about 30 minutes with Buddy and J.I. swapping lines. They were excited with the results. The band at that July session was made up of Buddy and J.I., accompanied by two other Texas boys, Sonny Curtis on guitar and Don Guess on bass. But the session almost didn't happen because when they got to Nashville, Don Guess didn't have a bass. He'd been renting one from Lubbock High School, and since school was not in session, he'd had to return it. Producer Owen Bradley gave them 20 minutes to find a bass or the session would be canceled. Thinking quickly, they ran over to WSM, home of the Grand Ole Opry, and borrowed a bass from legendary country session player Lightning Chance. Bass in hand, the band knocked out 5 songs in 3 hours. Girl on My Mind, Rock Around with Ali B, Ting-a-Ling, I'm Changing All Those Changes, and That'll Be the Day. These days, we think of some of these cuts as rockabilly classics, but Decca didn't feel that way at the time. Producer Owen Bradley called That'll Be the Day the worst song he had ever heard, and opted not to release any of the cuts. Paul Cohen, Decca's head of artists and repertoire, told Buddy he didn't have the voice to be a singer, and he should give up his dreams of a career in music. He reportedly called Buddy the biggest no talent I have ever worked with. Buddy would eventually have one more session in Nashville that December, and would have another single released, but without the support of management, he knew he was going nowhere with Decca. If we were talking about anybody other than Buddy Holly, that might have been the end of the story. These songs would have come out on an obscure compilation in the 1970s, and we would have all thought they were cool and moved on. But we are talking about Buddy, and so this was not the end of the story. Discouraged but determined, Buddy and J.I. returned to Lubbock and went into an intense period of rehearsing and gigging, often just as a duo with guitar and drums. They booked some studio time in town and recorded some very rough demos of a bunch of covers they'd been playing at the Lubbock Youth Center. Buddy and J.I. were convinced that That'll Be the Day could be a hit, and if Decca wouldn't put it out, somebody would. It was around this time, late 1956, that Buddy reestablished contact with Norman Petty, a producer and engineer with his own studio in Clovis, New Mexico, a bit over 90 miles from Lubbock. Petty was proving that he had a knack for recording rock and roll with guys from West Texas. Roy Orbison had recorded the first version of Ooby Dooby there, and soon after releasing it on a small local label was at Sun Records. Buddy Knox had recorded Party Doll in Clovis and landed a contract with the Roulette label. Norman Petty could capture the right sounds and had the connections in the music business that could get those sounds pressed. So Norman Petty seemed like Buddy's best chance. Buddy figured he could record a demo version of That'll Be the Day in Clovis and then see if Petty could use his connections and that demo to get a new record contract. Decca did let Buddy's contract lapse in January 1957, and Buddy got ready to re-record That'll Be the Day. The group that assembled to record on February 24, 1957, included only Buddy and J.I. from the July session. Sonny Curtis had left the group to tour with Slim Whitman. Don Guess still didn't have a bass. Buddy called up Larry Wellborn, who he'd worked with before, and who actually had a bass. He also recruited Nicky Sullivan, a good local guitarist and singer, and who, unknown to both of them, was Buddy's third cousin. As Elvis Presley was using the Jordanaires on his records by this point, Buddy wanted backing vocals and pulled in Gary and Ramona Tollett to sing. The session got started about 9 o'clock that evening. Norman Petty liked to record at night as the noise from the trucks rumbling down the main road was less frequent, and his father's auto repair shop next door was closed for the day, so there was less banging to contend with. They spent several hours working on Looking for Someone to Love, a song Buddy had written just a day or two before. He'd had some trouble finishing the tune. In fact, it was only completed during the drive to the studio when Buddy's brother Larry suggested the great fourth verse based on something Buddy's fun-loving mother used to say. Drunk man, streetcar, foot slip, there you are, I'm looking for someone to love. The mood in the studio was loose and fun, in stark contrast to the tightly scheduled Nashville sessions. With everyone all warmed up from working through Looking for Someone to Love, with all the mic placements set, That'll Be the Day took only about 3 or 4 takes to finish up. By 3 o'clock that morning, they knew they had recorded something special. This was a much better record than what they'd done at Owen Bradley's studio. Looking back at the two versions, you have to admit that Decca was probably right in this particular case. What were the differences between a hit and a miss? What's different between the Nashville and Clovis versions? Tune into part 3 and I'll break it all down. Even though the Nashville and Clovis versions are the exact same song with the exact same structure, there were some big differences in the recording and the performances that distinguished the hit from the version that Decca decided to write off. I'll break those differences down here. This next part is a mixture of fact and opinion, so your mileage may vary. The first and most obvious difference is the key the song is sung in. Country star Webb Pierce had advised Buddy, saying, "If you want a hit, sing as high as you can." Taking this a bit too far, Buddy set the song in the key of D for the Nashville version, 4 full steps higher than his natural register, making Buddy's vocal sound strained and pitchy. The hit version we all know and love is in the key of A, the same key as many of Buddy's biggest hits. Here's a bit of That'll Be the Day in the Nashville key of D. That'll be the day when you say goodbye. And now let's put it into the key of A, where Buddy did it on the hit version. Buddy used capo on this song. That'll be the day when you make me cry. The next difference is the beat. The Nashville version has the feel of an attempt to play rhythm and blues. It doesn't really sound like Buddy and J.I. have figured out the song quite yet. Some of the other songs cut that day, like Ollie V, are real firecrackers, but not this one. The intense rehearsing that Buddy and J.I. did in late 1956 after the Nashville session resulted in a much tighter and more powerfully swinging beat. In the Clovis version, rather than sounding like novice R&B players, Buddy and J.I. have mastered rock and roll. Another key factor is the overall sound quality of the recordings. The Clovis cut just simply sounds better. This is a real testament to Norman Petty's engineering skill, to the design of the studio he literally built by hand, to his patience, and to the attention he paid to the artists he recorded. Owen Bradley's Quonset hut in Nashville was one of the finest studios in America, and Owen Bradley is one of the finest producers. They clearly had the equipment and the engineering talent to make great records. The fantastic country hits put out by Decca in the 50s are evidence. Bradley recorded Patsy Cline's Walkin' After Midnight there, as well as 9-year-old Brenda Lee's astonishing Bigelow 6200. The studio was rented out to other labels and producers to record classic rockabilly numbers like Gene Vincent's Bebop-A-Lula and the rock and roll trio's Train Kept A-Rollin', both recorded only weeks before Buddy's July session. But just as clearly, and in his own words, Owen Bradley said he didn't really understand what Buddy was trying to do, and 19-year-old Buddy Holly didn't know how to explain it. There was no outward animosity towards the band. Sonny Curtis had said, "They just kind of turned on the mics and let us do our thing." The result is that the Nashville version of That'll Be the Day is buried in murky reverb, and the band is mixed well into the background. In contrast, Petty's recording is sparkling, with every instrument and voice audible and sitting at just the right sonic spot. The backing vocals by Nikki Sullivan and Gary and Ramona Tollett, recorded live with the band, are the icing on a really terrific cake. The more relaxed atmosphere Norman Petty created had to have a lot to do with it. The Clovis session took 6 hours to develop the 2 songs recorded, as opposed to the 3-hour Nashville session that cranked out 5. There's one last, very important element that cements That'll Be the Day's place as one of the elemental songs in the rock and roll canon. And it's that great guitar lick that bursts out of the speakers to start the song. The intro to the Nashville version is kind of tired and unspectacular in comparison. It's okay for a roller rink show, but not for a top 10 hit. That'll be the day. The lick from the Clovis version, while still based in a common blues turnaround, is something really innovative. What I think happened here is that Buddy copped the piano intro from Fats Domino's Blue Monday and transformed it into a guitar lick. Blue Monday is one of those covers from that late 1956 demo session, and on that demo, Buddy plays the intro just the way he does in the hit version of That'll Be the Day. Buddy had played similar licks before, particularly on Ting-a-Ling and Rockabye Rock, but never with this particularly great phrasing.
Well, that'll be the day.
I should note here that a similar lick appears on a Hank Ballard record from 1955 called Switchy Witchy Twitchy, though not as prominently as in That'll Be the Day. Sonny Curtis thinks that Lonnie Johnson's Jelly Roll Baker might have been the inspiration. Buddy certainly knew both of those songs, but I can't draw the straight line to either of them the way that I can to the Fats record. With all these new factors in its favor, the great song that Buddy and J.I. wrote could shine through. They knew they had a potential hit record, but there was one huge problem that threatened to keep That'll Be the Day buried forever. Norman Petty and the band knew they had something special with their re-recorded version of That'll Be the Day. It was head and shoulders above the version that Buddy had cut in Nashville 7 months before. But in the couple of days following the session, those good feelings were replaced by concern. Buddy realized that he had a clause in his contract with Decca that prohibited him from re-recording and releasing any song that he'd already recorded for Decca, and he was bound to that clause for the next 5 years. While he was no longer a Decca recording artist, the great track they had just recorded could not legally be released. Buddy decided to call Decca and see if there was any way around this. He wound up talking to Paul Cohen, who you'll recall had called Buddy the biggest no talent he'd ever worked with. Amazingly, there is actually a recording of this call. Buddy tries to see if Decca will give him a release to re-record some of those songs he cut last summer, just in case he wanted to try and re-record them sometime in the future. Paul Cohen gets a whiff that something's up and lets Buddy know that there is no way he can release anything that he's already recorded for Decca. Buddy keeps up the pretense for several minutes, but the call ends with no relief for Buddy. Norman Petty, always thinking, comes up with a solution. If Buddy can't release the song, they'll just leave his name off the record. Rather than putting out a Buddy Holly record, they'll just release the song under the name of a group, figuring that Decca will never notice. Now they just needed a name. Naming groups after birds or insects was popular at the time. Buddy and Jerry liked a group called the Spiders, so they got out an encyclopedia and started going through the insects. J.I. later said that they considered the grasshoppers and the beetles for a minute before settling on the crickets. They liked the idea that crickets were a musical insect and that it made a happy sound. There's a popular story that they chose the name because you can hear a cricket on the end of one of their records. This is actually half true. You can hear a cricket chirping in time and in tune at the end of I'm Gonna Love You Too. But by the time they recorded that song, the band had already been called the Crickets for about 4 months. When we think of the group today, we think of Buddy Holly and the Crickets. While they were often billed that way on performances, there were no records released by Buddy Holly and the Crickets during Buddy's lifetime. They were either Buddy Holly records or Crickets records. One more last note about bass players. While Larry Wellborn is the bass player on That'll Be the Day, he was never officially a Cricket. Joe B. Malden, the 16-year-old bass player in Larry Wellborn's steady band, the Four Teens, was recruited by Buddy and J.I. for a pickup gig sometime in March 1957. On the drive home from the show, they asked him to join the band and promised that they'd be rich. Joe B. had heard it all before, but he agreed, signed the contracts, and officially became a Cricket. Now Norman Petty went to work, sending out the Clovis demo of That'll Be the Day under the name of the Crickets, with no mention of Buddy or his contractual obligations to Decca. In an interesting twist, that demo was picked up and released as a master on the Brunswick label, a subsidiary of Decca. So the world did get a chance to hear That'll Be the Day, and fell in love with Buddy Holly. Buddy was able to keep recording and putting out great records right up until his untimely death in that plane crash less than 2 years later. If not for Buddy's determination, desire, and skill, paired with the studio mastery of Norman Petty, plus a little bit of contractual violation and a fib or two, we might never have heard all that great music, and the world would be a poorer place. By the way, once That'll Be the Day was selling millions of copies for Brunswick, Decca pressed and released the Nashville version they'd been sitting on. I suspect the kids who bought that record were kind of surprised. I'm J.P. McDermott for West Coast Ramble. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of That'll Be the Day. In the description below, you can find links to a YouTube playlist for all the songs I've mentioned here, as well as a bibliography of some of the sources I used in putting this together. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon with another edition of True Tales on West Coast Ramble.